Wow, happy to see so many people here. I'm nosy.
We'll still do a few more, so we'll just hold on just a couple of minutes.
While we're waiting, should I pose with Helen's new book?
Yeah, you can do.
Don't embarrass me because I don't have your copy with me. I gave yours away.
It's some subliminal advertising as we go along.
Might just hold books up.
I should have put some book covers on the picture actually, shouldn't I? Okay, I think we'll make a start and I can carry on letting people in as we go along. So good afternoon to everybody and welcome to our session on reading children's literature in translation, and also a very happy International Women's Day to everybody as well. And what better way to celebrate International Women's Day than with our two brilliant invited speakers this afternoon, Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp and Helen Wang, who are both literary translators with a special interest in the translation of literature for children and for young adults. So as always with this series of talks, our focus is going to be on the reader of the translated literature. And today we're going to be looking at such issues as the different readers that are involved in the translation and publishing process of children's literature. The voices that we hear or that we don't hear and that we should hear in relation to the reading of translated literature. We're going to think about the role of different agents involved in the translation and publishing process. And we're also going to think about what we can do and what is being done to promote a more culturally diverse reading experience for younger audiences. As always, the talks are aimed to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, then please do pop them in the chat and I'll keep my eye on it as we go along. There will also be time at the end for questions and answers. So if you'd rather hold your question and ask it in person at the end, then you're more than welcome to do that as well. Just before we make a start on today's session, I just want to say a couple of words about some of the upcoming events that we have in the next coming months. As any of you that have already attended one of these reading and translation sessions, you'll know that these talks are part of a wider project called Reading Across Cultures, which is based at University College Cork and funded by the Irish Research Council and Marie Curie under the Caroline scheme. And it's thanks to them today that this event is going ahead. We have several events planned for the upcoming months. Our next event is on the 22nd of March, where we're going to be looking at genre fiction in translation. And this event is going to take a slightly different format because we're going to be doing it as a machine translation workshop. So our focus is going to be on the translation of genre fiction, in particular chick lit in translation, but translated using machine translation, and how that impacts on the reading experience. And that's going to be led by Dr. Susan Pickford from the University Paris Sorbonne. In April, we have a session coming up on reading African literature in translation, and among the speakers will be Dr. Georgina Collins, who's just been doing a project on literary translation in Cameroon. On the 3rd of May, we have a session on activism and translation, and we're thrilled to be able to be joined by JD Plucker, the translator, activist and artist, who's going to be talking about their work. Finally, we have our conference around the theme of reading and translation on May the 17th and the 18th. The call for papers is closed for that now, but registration will be opening shortly. So for any information about those events that are upcoming, or any of the events that we've done in the past, then please hop over to Facebook and have a look at our Facebook page, which is Reading Across Cultures. The link is there on the screen. But if you're not on Facebook and you'd like to get in touch, or you'd like to get involved somehow, then please don't hesitate to drop me an email at jennifer.arnold@ucc.ie. So that's what has been and what's coming up. But now moving back on to today, as I said, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our two speakers, Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp and Helen Wang, to be with us to talk today. They're both really experienced literary translators with a wealth and breadth of knowledge and experience with children's literature in translation. So I'm thrilled that they were able to join us. For those of you who might not be familiar with their work, I'm just going to give a brief intro to both of them. Ruth is a British literary translator working from German, Russian and Arabic into English. She mainly translates children's books, adult fiction and literary non-fiction, and has a particular interest in history. She's translated novels by Katja Frischer, Katrin Roman, Hannah Winter and Julia Yakovleva, and non-fiction titles by Germany's best-selling nature writer Peter Wohlleben and cultural historian Ulrich Ralph. Her translation of Ralph's Farewell to the Horse was Sunday Times History Book of the Year in 2017, and it was shortlisted for the 2019 Helen and Kurt Wolff's Translator Prize. She's a passionate advocate of translated literary fiction and international children's fiction, and helps coordinate and publicise World Kidlit Month in September. She's co-editor of 3 blogs about translated children's books: World Kidlit, Russian Kidlit and Arab Kidlit. Now, I don't know how she has time to translate as well. Helen Wang is an award-winning Chinese to English translator and sinologist who works as curator of East Asian money at the British Museum in London. She was one of the original editors of an organisation called Read Paper Republic, whose mission is to promote Chinese literature in translation. And in September 2016, she started a new project, Chinese Books for Young Readers, with Anna Gustafson Chen and Minji Chen. In 2017, she won the Marsh Award for Literature in Translation for her translation of Bronze and Sunflower by Cao Wenxuan, and in the same year was awarded the Chen Potri Special Contribution Award for her translations and increasing visibility of Chinese children's books. So thank you both very much for joining me this afternoon. So I guess to kind of ease us into this discussion and to kind of start more generally, Ruth, maybe you could talk to us a little bit more in general terms about what we mean when we talk about children's literature in translation, and how does it fare to other categories in translations, kind of the adult fiction and so on.
Well, I'll preface this by saying I don't take a very academic approach to this, and I'm sure that recently, for example, I went to a brilliant talk at UEA by Dr. B.J. Epstein, who approached this in a very academic way, thinking what is a child, what is children's literature, and I thought that was wonderful, but that's beyond what I would do or I could do. But I suppose the definition that we're interested in at Project World Kidlit is any books that are translated from any language into English, which might plausibly be read by children or teenagers. And so, of course, that includes picture books, early grade readers, so things like short fiction like this for really young and new readers. This is also translated by Helen, by the way. Then fiction for primary school children, middle grade fiction, that's sort of between primary school and secondary, and then teenage or young adult novels. But when we think about World Kid Lit at the blog and on the Twitter account, which incidentally was started by Helen as well, that wasn't in your intro, World Kid Lit Twitter, when we talk about it, then we also include graphic novels and comics, even though of course not all graphic novels are necessarily suitable for younger readers, but we just think that they sort of fall in a category that doesn't get much discussion, and it's not included in blogs and book review sites for literary fiction. So yeah, anything that young people might read except literary fiction, which is sort of dealt with elsewhere. Helen, what would you add?
Well, I wasn't one of the original founders of the World Kid Lit Twitter account. I founded something in 2012. I founded China Fiction Book Club UK with Nikki Harman, who's another translator, and she's just started translating Chinese children's books. She has a couple out due very soon. Shortly after that, I started something called Translated World. Unlike Ruth, I started translation maybe in the 1990s, early 1990s, and then left it and then came back. I left it because I didn't actually know you could have a career as a translator. And having done a few short stories and had them published for no money and for no acclaim and no feedback and no nothing, I went to have a job and have a family and all the rest of it. And then about 10 years ago, I started translating again. And people were saying, oh, there's no visibility, we can't do this, we can't do that. And I thought, well, let's just flag everybody up. So I started something called Translated World, which was a Twitter account, which Ruth joined me on for a bit. And that's now, I think, got about 8,000 followers. And I tend to think of it a bit of as flotsam and jetsam. It's a bit random. It's kind of whatever I have time for. And then joined in with the Global Literature and Libraries, which I think which has been going on very well for a while. And that's also very useful. That's started by librarians and translators who wanted to have some kind of a link, because there are people who borrow books in libraries. Librarians are interested in translated books, but they don't always have the time to go and source them or to buy them or to have much information about them. And so it's to bring translators who often have a lot of knowledge, but don't necessarily have the access to the audience or to the readers. So to bring everybody together. And then Marsha Links Quayle, who's another dynamo. If you think Ruth is a dynamo, you should meet Marsha, because she's just as fast. And she started World Kid Lit, and so we joined in there as well. I also have another one which I do with, as you mentioned before, with two people, which is called Chinese Books for Young Readers, because all of these audiences are sometimes quite specialized. People have a particular interest. Sometimes people who are interested in, say, Chinese things are not necessarily interested in stuff from, I don't know, France or Spain or Germany or Russia or Arabic or whatever. They want to know something specific, and they don't want to wade through all of the rest of it. So it's quite useful sometimes to have the specialist ones, but we also need to have the more cohesive, kind of like the synthetic ones, where people can all come together and kind of, oh, that's what they're doing. It's very similar to what I'm doing. And then it's quite an easy way to meet people.
Thank you. So how does, it's quite, we talk a lot more about kind of translated fiction more generally with a focus on adult fiction, and we have kind of like the lamented 3% of everything that's published in the UK and the US or the English speaking world is in translation. How does children's literature in translation fare in comparison to adult literature? Ruth, do you want to start with what kind of percentages are we talking about for children's literature in translation?
I would question that we have any really reliable data to compare that. And I would love to hear from academics who have more precise data. There's been a study by Literature Across Frontiers that looked at children's. It looked at books in translation across the board, and within that children's literature, and yeah, the figures weren't much higher than that 3%. But that was just data from the British Library. So okay, I shouldn't say just. Yeah, I think it's got limits. And there's been other studies. There's an organisation in America, the Cooperative Children's Book Centre. They've also got some statistics, but I think that's just US. And then Outside in World has also been collecting data for years, and they really are I'd say the authority sort of longer term on what's been published in translation for children. But again, I think that's had more of a focus on UK publications, not exclusively. So in the last 4 years, we, Could-Lit, have been sort of compiling these sources into our own database, which was also flawed. But we can't compare that to what's published, or we haven't yet, to what's published across the board for adults as well. But we can sort of break down the rough picture of types of books, so picture books, young adult, and so on. I can tell you that if you're interested. But Helen, what would you add in terms of where children's books fits in the broader picture?
One of the questions that we're often asked a lot is, can we have some statistics? Can we have some data? And it's really very, very difficult to collect this data. As Ruth said, there are people who collect the data, and there are some organizations who publish their data. The data collecting isn't consistent. And if you are an individual who wants to go and collect data for yourself, for your own purposes, or to add to what's there, it's really hard work. And one of the reasons why it's hard work is because how do you search? You can't, for example, go onto WorldCat and say, I'll look up all the people called translator, because not everybody who's a translator is ever named on there. So it's not consistent. And if somebody is, maybe the translator may be put as an author, they may be put as a translator. Occasionally they may be put as an editor. Often they're not put at all. And so it's a question of really, how do you find the books that have been translated? Many books don't, many kind of the databases that an ordinary person can access, they don't give you this data. They don't even necessarily tell you that it's translated. People who are doing the metadata, sort of in library cataloging, they do a fantastic job, but sometimes the ordinary person, which is often the translator, because if you're doing the translation, often you're doing it as on a freelance basis, so you don't have access to these big databases, the Nielsen databases of the databases, and it's quite difficult really to check. And so that's one of the things that we kind of, when we started the hashtag Name the Translator, part of it was just to make it standard so that you can actually do this collecting of data quite easily and not make a big song and dance about it, but just have it there. It's, I think translated world is 3 little words, not I love you or International Women's Day, but kind of like name the translator, even just put TR dot. It makes a huge difference. But it's not specifically children's literature, it's everything.
Yeah. And what about kind of children's literature as representative of the wider world? How inclusive is translation? Are the countries that are particularly well represented and countries that aren't and should be? Well, I mean, that's a given, I guess, but how is it in kind of terms of representation?
On the Chinese side, if you go into any bookstore, you go into any library, you probably won't find very much that's been translated. So you have to go and search for it. So there's not very much, but it's coming a little bit more. For some countries, there's a lot. There's much more from, say, French and German, Spanish, Italian, I think. Increasingly more from Russian, thanks to Ruth. There's a few from Japanese. Again, it's a question of looking a little bit further afield. There's some Latvian books that are coming through from the Emma Press. So it's kind of some small presses are picking up on other books as well. The difference is if you want to do it backwards and forwards, I'll show you some photos that I took a couple of years ago in a bookshop in China. This is a bookshop. This is a table in a bookshop. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a city bookshop. This is the children's section. You go into the bookshop, you go upstairs, and those are the 2 tables that they had with books that are translated from English. Just mind-boggling. You go around the corner in this bookshop, there's another set of bookshelves, and many of the books on there were translated. They were picture books, and they were translated from Japanese and Korean. And sometimes we forget that in different parts of the world, people aren't just translating to and from English. They're translating from different regions and different kinds of things. So you possibly in India, you'll get some children's books from China will be published in India before they're published in another English language. But because of the publishing rights and the way the publishing system works in the world, we don't necessarily have access to them, even if they've been translated.
Ruth, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, so the very small scale sort of study that I did when I did a talk back in December, I pulled some stats just looking at it was 18 or 20 different languages, and it's really striking. This is just looking at books we got on our list WebKit from 2017, so just the last 4 years. It's so striking. The French is way up at the top with 74 books in translation, and then the next big hitter is German with 39, so it's really twice as many from French, which isn't a surprise. It's one of the most studied foreign languages for English speakers, and then Spanish next at 28 books. And then there's some sort of maybe more surprising big hitters like Swedish and Dutch, but when you think about the sort of financial support behind those literatures, it's not surprising. You know, the Swedish and Dutch cultural, and also Norwegian, those cultural institutes put a lot of money into paying for sample translations and promoting their literature, and that results in a lot more books being published. And then big, huge population languages with big populations like Russian, Arabic, Chinese, they're all under 20 books translated in the last 4 years, as far as we know. Jenny, you're frowning. How is the audio when I'm speaking? We had a couple of messages saying that my audio is bad. Is it unbearable? Should I switch devices?
Do you want to have a go at switching devices, and I'll send the next question.
Can you ask Helen a question while I just pop off for about 5 minutes? I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. It's kind of coming and going a little bit. So so Helen, if I talk to you a little bit about and next question, and I guess kind of talking about how representative something is, and how little there is from certain countries, has got a lot to do with assumptions that's made on the readers and the market that the books are being aimed at. So we kind of have to think about who the readers are and how the books are getting through, and kind of the assumptions that are being made about the readers. Could you talk to us a little bit about, first of all, when we're talking about translated literature for children or for young adults, who the readers are? Because I guess there's 2 different kinds of readers. There's the children as well, but there's the people who buy the books, isn't there? So we're also in some ways, it's particularly for little children, we're talking about the parents as readers as well, aren't we?
I think as well as the children, the parents are quite significant readers. I mean, I'm not as active in the children's world as the children's book world as Ruth is, because I have another job, but my experience of my own books is that probably as many adults read them, or more adults read them than children read them. So it's kind of like there's the children's books, but they're read by adults. The picture book world, I think there is quite a significant number of adults who read picture books or who collect picture books, because the art in picture books is often really quite stunning. So the art itself is really, really fantastic, and as well as the art, there's also sometimes the storylines are, shall we say, subversive, or they're a little bit wacky, or a little bit pushing ideas or pushing boundaries. And so there are things that come through in picture books that don't necessarily come through in other ways. And I think this is one of the reasons why there will always be a supply of picture books, because it's not just that, there are more children, so we need more books. And there are more children who are coming into a new world, so we need more books for the new world. But there's also new ideas and new thinking. So if you go, for example, to the children's book fair at Bologna, or to the one I know better, which is the one in Shanghai, very often there will be an exhibition of the children's book art, the art that's in the children's books, and there'll be competitions and there'll be winners. And it's quite stunning. It's really quite stunning what comes out. There's a woman called Sonia Donoska who has been illustrating. She was asked to illustrate a children's book, which, when it was first published in China, I don't think it did particularly well. And when she did the illustrations, this is a woman who's an artist. She's based in Poland, and she'd never been to China. She had absolutely nothing to do with China. And when she was asked to do these illustrations, she looks up some pictures, she watched some films, and she illustrated this book. And it's uncanny how real she's made the scenes work out. And so there've been a number of projects done by the Chinese publishing import-export company, and the overriding body that deals with the rights if the publishers aren't dealing with it directly themselves, who have paired up either a foreign as in non-Chinese, a Chinese artist or illustrator with a writer, or vice versa. And so you get these combinations that are really quite interesting. So Roger Mello, who's from Brazil, who's a really fantastic artist and illustrator of children's books, he paired up with Helen Wang, who was one of the authors that I've translated middle grade books of. Helen has also done some picture books with Yurong, who's a Chinese artist who's now based in the UK. And so, you know, there's a lot of different artistic techniques that are coming through. So that's on the illustration side. On the kind of the textual side, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult, because sometimes in children's books you have things that are really the essence of a culture. And so something, you know, sometimes the things that are most of your psyche or your nature or your essence or your culture's essence is the things that you're taught when you're very, very, very little, perhaps by your grandparents or by something that's very local to you or in the home, and you don't really get to access these things outside. And so the feeling of, I don't want to say the feeling of nostalgia, but the feeling of, oh yes, the recognition feeling, sometimes it can be quite hard to get. In my case, I didn't grow up. I had nothing to do with China until I was 18, and I went to university and started to learn it. So I have no childhood knowledge of any of this. And children's books in China, although they started maybe in the early 20th century, they didn't really get going and have a really big push internationally until this century. And so things are all very, very, very different. It can be really quite tricky sometimes if you, for example, a lot of things are to do with food. So if you have a lot of memories, food or ideas or stories that revolve around food or these kind of things, how on earth do you evoke this? It's actually really very difficult, because there's a lot of stories behind food. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of rhythm. The Chinese have a lot of things that are called like 4-character phrases. So you'll have 4 characters and they have a particular rhythm. So you maybe have A-A-B-B or A-B-A-B or D-D-Da-Da, something like this. And so you have to have this kind of understanding. You also have to know if there's a story behind it and these kind of things. So a lot of the general cultural knowledge, you know, for example, we might say, oh, Cinderella or Snow White, and you instantly know what's going on in the story. Sometimes if you don't have that recognition in the target language, it can be quite tricky to know what to do with it, and it can either feel very strange and off-putting, or it can feel very strange and very exciting. I have one book. This is a book that's just been published. It's called The Ode to the Goddess of the Moor River, and it's a picture book. It's a beautifully designed book, beautifully illustrated book.
Yeah.
And this story, you know, if you have no idea of anything about to do with China, you wouldn't know that this is a really, really, really famous story. It's a really, really famous painting. It's kind of has so many resonances in Chinese history, and yet if you try to look it up, it's quite difficult to get a grip as to just how much it touches, if you like, the soul of somebody who's done this as a child and has grown up with this. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to set up something like Chinese books for young readers, which was to get underneath and to get inside the skin of things, because unless you can do that, you can't get the magic. And if you can't get the magic, then the books aren't going to work in another language. So that's what I try to do. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm trying to do.
It absolutely does. But I guess, I mean, one of the questions that we were going to cover today was the idea of the translator as reader as well, which, I mean, talking about the vast array of different readers who are involved in this kind of process, you know, and the translator as reader and then creator. So you it's really interesting because you're reading, I guess, as somebody who's specialized in the source culture, but also kind of, so being able to take that, but also knowing the expectations of the readers in the language you're translating into, to be able to feed into those. So I guess a translator as a reader both of the text that they're reading, but of a body of literature, children's literature that you've grown up with as well, to be able to feed into those expectations is really important, I guess.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that my children are grown up now, but when my children were little, I wanted them to read Chinese stories, so I used to ask people to bring them back, and sometimes they'd look at them and they'd want to have a look at them. So because they were in Chinese, I used to read it to them in English. I'd read in Chinese in my head and I'd read to them in English, which is great because it means that you very quickly discover what works and what doesn't work. And small children have the patience level of about an ant. And the moment you've hesitated too long, there will be a pillow fight, or they'll need the toilet, or a glass of water, or they'll start kind of pulling things to pieces. And so it has to work for the reader. And whether the reader's a child, or whether the reader's an adult, or whether the reader's the editor in the publishing house, the patience level is like seconds. And if you're not, it's like the cover. If you don't like the cover, or you don't like the first page, or you don't like whichever bit you dip into, you're just not going to read it. So there has to be something that pulls you in to start with, and then there has to be something that holds you. Otherwise, you're reading it for a different purpose. You're not reading it for pleasure. So there's, you can read things for all kinds of different reasons, and at which point you give away the spoiler is one of the things, the tension.
Ruth, have you got anything to add about the idea of readers, of who the readers are involved in the translation and publication process? And I guess I guess one of the interesting things about commissioning a work of children's fiction in translation as opposed to an adult fiction is that anybody who's going to commission it is the target audience, aren't they, for of an adult fiction. It's not the case in the children's fiction. So what can you talk to us about the roles of the different readers for translated literature for children?
Yeah, I thought I'd pick up from what Helen was saying about concentration spans, and one thing that's really noticeable about, and I find really interesting about translated picture books, is that often the ones that are translated into English, whether they're European or from further afield, they're very different standards of length, content, target age. There's a lot more picture books that are translated that are for older readers, so for older primary, dealing with more difficult topics, and they're not necessarily the sort of books that the children would take off the shelf and buy for themselves. They really are sold through the mediation of parents who want to introduce cultural or sort of ethical, moral topics for conversation. And picture books are a perfect medium for that, for not just an exciting story, but also talking about subjects together, whether it's death, whether it's human rights, all this thing. And of course, there's books in English that deal with that too. But as I think it's okay to say that there's much more rigid rules in English or UK publishing for picture books, that it has to be 32 pages. It has to have sort of arc that fits within a story reading session that lasts 20 minutes, say. And anything longer is going to test the patience of a child. But a lot of picture books in translation, they're intended for older readers or for reading over a couple of sessions. Just because it's a picture book, it doesn't mean you have to sit down and read it in one bedtime necessarily. I've got a pile of picture books here, but I'm not sure which is the best to sort of illustrate that one. But this is one that we read the other day, The Fox and the Swing, and it's one of those ones that it's really got a lot more pages in it than a traditional English picture book. And I read this with my 10-year-old and 7-year-old, and fortunately they did have a patience for it and they enjoyed it. Wonderful pictures and lots to talk about in the pictures. But it definitely took longer to read than a picture book that we might get in English would do. So yeah, in terms of the sort of sales and who children's books in translation are marketed to, well, as Helen's already said, in a lot of cases they're not marketed as anything other than English books, and there isn't a lot of attention drawn to the fact that they're translated. In other cases, yeah, it's to a lot of that successful marketing, I think, comes on social media. So there's a lot of presses like Book Island that have a really active community of readers among teachers, academics in education. So groups like on Twitter, there's the OU Reading for Pleasure group. There's a lot of teachers involved in the sort of weekly book group discussions for primary teachers, and Matthew Tobin at Oxford Brookes is actively often tweets about children's books in translation. And so successful publishers like Book Island, this is the Book Island book, for example, Maya and What Matters, you know, they really tap into that need in primary schools for books that deal with topics and books that you can get into and talk about, you know, on a longer term basis, not just a quick read, but one to sort of delve into in terms of the illustrations and the difficult topics. So this one, for example, is about a little girl and her grandmother who has a stroke, I think. And so it deals with with communication, the difficulty of understanding all the feelings of you know, half losing a family member. She's there, but she's not there. She's not able to speak. And it's this incredible dreamy world of grief, but also hope at the same time. And then at the end there is a death as well. And you know, that's a difficult topic and a difficult theme for a picture book. And it's, you know, it's represented in these dark, atmospheric illustrations. But there's so much there for discussion with children, even up to secondary school. You know, it's like, I think yeah, picture books in translation really open up a sort of another genre of books on challenging topics.
That's really interesting why that can happen in translation, but it doesn't, and it's only being published by small presses. Then I assume it would, bigger presses going to go for kind of more mainstream.
Not necessarily. I've translated 4 middle grade novels, and three have been published by big presses, so by Walker Books, 2 by Walker Books, 1 by Egmont, and the 4th one was published by a small press called Balestier Press, which works in both Singapore and in the UK. The thing with the bigger presses is that they often have a bigger budget, and they often have more staff, and so although that allows them to do things on a different scale, it also means that they probably have very set systems. And so there'll be sometimes with a smaller press, there can be fewer people and it can be harder work, but they may be more flexible and they may be able to do things that maybe the big publishers can't, and vice versa. In terms of the readers, depending on the marketing, you may or you may not see more from a smaller publisher or more from a bigger publisher. It just depends on how the marketing goes out. And you know, you can say that word of mouth is probably the best way to sell books, but you have to at some point get the book out there so that somebody sees it first of all.
I wondered, there's often a talk about a perceived risk from the publisher in publishing. I'm talking about adult fiction, because you know, financially there's you know, you're paying out for a translator, you're paying out for the translation rights as well, so financially there's a perceived risk with publishing books in translation. And I wonder if, because they might not sell, because there's there is an assumption that Anglophone readers don't want to read in translation as well, which I think still kind of exists out. And I wonder whether that perceived risk exists within the translation of children's literature or not, or less so. Ruth, do you want to? Sorry.
May I start? Thank you. I think it really divides source languages or source countries into a group of one that's safe because there's funding, and one that's a risk because there's not funding and there's not an established sort of community around promoting that literature. I think the organisations like in NORLA in Norway have such a big role in terms of funding the translation. So this one is, for example, lovely one published in the US, Brown, and this one the Batchelder Award in the US, which is a librarian-led award for children's books in translation. And you know, the translation for that was paid for by the Norwegian government, NORLA. If you look in the insides of most of the books in my collection, you know, there's so many of them are sponsored or funded by a cultural body. Or else there was another scheme behind it, like the Another Word scheme, which was run by Book Trust for 2 years. And they had Arts Council England funding to to support the translation, but also the marketing budget to a limited extent, marketing for books in translation. And I think about 6 books were published with that funding behind them. So this was one from South Africa, one of very, very few books that have been translated from Afrikaans, and this one from Russia, which I translated. But beyond that, if there hasn't been some money from a cultural institute or some other Arts Council funding or English Pen funding, then yeah, it is a big risk. And that's, I think, a very strong reason why a lot of languages have still had very little or almost nothing translated, because if there isn't the money to pay for translators to do samples, or if there isn't a magazine or a cultural publication like New Books in German or New Swedish Books, Swedish Book Review, if there isn't something like that, like New Books in Georgian, I'm afraid there isn't a cultural body sort of promoting Georgian children's books, or Armenian, or even Turkish. There's just not enough people working it. There are literary agents, but if the agents themselves don't have funding to, or stream funding to pay for translation samples, then how do they make that first step to sending their work to publishers?
I mean, there is one scheme that's I recently learned about. There's a publisher in New York called Raycraft Books, and they recently started producing books, mostly picture books, and they are linked to kind of a market, doing markets of marketing the books through schools. So although they sell the books retail, they also have an entree into the schools market, which is really very important. So I don't know how publishers in the UK work. I mean, this is one of the problems of being a translator and is not having necessarily the knowledge of how publishing really works. So sometimes you find out by accident, or you find out on purpose how things work. How to get the books into schools, how to get the books into libraries, how to get into those streams. This is one of the reasons why Global Literature and Libraries was set up, was kind of how to get the books to the readers. It's also kind of, it's kind of a pet thing of mine, because when my children were little, I wanted to buy more and to borrow more translated literature for them, but that was in the 1990s. But I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know who to ask, and my local library, I don't think offered much advice in that respect. Perhaps they didn't know, or I didn't ask, or whatever. And I'd never heard of the Bachelor. I'd never heard of any of these prizes. I'd never heard of anything. I was just simply looking in bookshops and looking in libraries, and just couldn't work out why not. And the books that I did know that had been translated when I was a child. It's like Heidi and the Cow That Fell in the Canal and these other books. And it was like, well, where do you actually find these books? Do you only ever find them in junk shops and secondhand bookstores? I just didn't know where to go. And so it's, maybe I should have asked harder, but I didn't know who to ask either.
Yeah, I mean, the market's changed dramatically, hasn't it? Like beyond recognition since then. And now, thankfully, there is another online retailer, which is less slightly preferable perhaps to buying books from Amazon. You can go to bookshop.org and there's a lot of books represented, but there's a lot of books that you might hear about in translation, but actually they're only published in the US and they're difficult to buy here, or extremely expensive to buy here. But I think another factor that's different, that's really interesting what you said about Raycroft and how they're selling direct to schools. Also, the market in the US is really very different because of the size of the library market. Libraries have a lot bigger budgets there. School libraries have a lot more clout and ability to buy books. That's really restricted here. So I'm not sure how much publishers. I think the bookshops like Waterstones are probably, I think, still the sort of the main bulk of that market, but perhaps that's changing. I don't have any academic facts on that. One of my points
is that when people say, "Oh, there isn't any demand," actually, I don't think that's true. I think you can't say that if the readers don't demand, then we won't stock it, and if nobody will stock it, then we won't produce it. I think there is a demand, but it's actually, people are busy, parents are busy, teachers are busy, grandparents are busy. It's quite hard work or used to be anyway, it used to be very hard work to find a lot of this information. So this question, how do you make it easy for people?
Yeah, I see that demand because almost every day on Twitter, a teacher, more teachers than parents, but often a teacher will ask, please, we want to read, we've got, say, Romanian or Polish pupils in our class, we'd love to find a book that's set in Poland or a book about Poland. And that's when we jump on and say, it's not just about books that are set in Poland, what about reading a book that's translated from Polish or from Poland, a book that people in Poland are currently reading. And so I think sometimes it's not necessarily a lack of demand, but actually a lack of awareness that this is even a possibility, that there are books that are translated. Obviously, I think once teachers or parents sort of tap into that and they realize what's out there, then that creates a demand, doesn't it? The more you realize, oh, we could, whether it's at home in our family or at school, we could read a book from every country in Europe, we could read a book from every, from 30 countries around the world or more. That creates a curiosity that I think perhaps isn't there when people don't know anything about the process of translation or the fact that children's books are ever translated.
I think it has a lot to do with visibility, doesn't it? I guess, yeah. And it's what Helen was saying before about making the books visible. So if people can't see, if you have to go and find them, then it's harder work, isn't it? Yeah. And I guess one of the ways that I mean, there are many ways, but one of the ways that we can make them, or they can be made visible, is by being read and being reviewed. So how do children's books in translation fare in terms of being reviewed, in terms of, getting any kind of publicity that kind of goes beyond the platforms that you'd have to go and look for, that are there, that generate the interest in niche children's literature, so kind of mainstream, I guess?
And I say, well, when was the last time you saw a children's book that's been translated, reviewed in a national newspaper? It doesn't happen. It does happen, but it doesn't happen very often. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of books are produced every year, children's books, and they can't all get reviewed. And there are very, very few reviewers actually in mainstream places. One of my books, that won the Marsh Award in 2017. I don't know how many times, it won numerous prizes, it won numerous kind of shortlists, quite surprisingly, really. And so a lot of friends in China or publishers in China, they say, "Oh, Helen, tell us how many books has it sold? How many copies have been sold in the UK?" And on at least 2 or 3 times a year, I'll get a PhD student in China who writes to me and says, "Oh, please, could you answer some questions?" And one of the questions is, how many hundreds of millions of books and copies has it sold in the UK? And the answer is, I'm not going to answer your question, because to answer your question, I have to go to the publisher and I have to ask the publisher, how many copies of this book have you sold? And I'm not comfortable doing that. And so just recently I did ask my editor, and I did say, I asked this question so many times, mostly I just ignore it because I can't say how many hundreds of millions of copies it sold, literally, because he sold hundreds of millions of copies in China. And he's not exactly a household name here. And she said, well, we don't normally give this information out, but it's been out for a while, it's been out sale for a while, so maybe I'll go and try and find out from our sales department. 5-6 weeks later, still no answer. So, okay, this is not really something that the UK publishers are particularly willing to share. But in China, they will say how many copies are printed. They'll print it in the front of the book. Here, we don't. The publishers won't tell you whether they printed 100 copies or print on demand or 5 billion copies. It's quite difficult to give those kind of statistics to people who want them.
Ruth, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, in terms of places to go for reviews, well, besides Well Could Lit blog and Global Literature and Libraries, which Helen's already talked about, they have every Wednesday, World Could Lit Wednesday, and their interpretation of Well Could Lit includes books that are not translated. So sometimes it's not translated books, but often it is, and they have excellent reviews. There's Kirkus in the US really does review a lot of children's books, and also the bookseller and those suddenly forgotten, Publishers Weekly, they often review children's books in the US and label and highlight that books are translated. But yeah, as Helen said, in the UK, if they are included in a roundup in the Guardian, say, or other places, you know, it's such a cursory mention. Often there isn't a mention of that it's a translation. I've forgotten to have it ready to show you, but there's a really brilliant publication by the School Librarians Association,
Riveting Reads.
or SLD, Riveting Reads, which is edited by Joy Court and Daniel Hahn, and it's an overview of several years worth of children's books in translation, but that was up until 2017. That's why we started collecting data from 2017. We're like, we want to carry out this on, we want to keep this visibility going, really.
Ruth, I suspect that the Riveting Reads was quite a lot of work for Joy Court and Daniel Hahn to put together. And so if the data can be collected not just once every 5 years or however many years, but on a regular basis, it's much easier just to pull it all together. Yeah. But we're nowhere near that stage yet. It would be lovely to be able to do that. So, you know, the work that you're particularly doing on the World Kitlet with collecting the per country and collecting the data, it's an incredibly useful start to do that.
Yeah, I hope so. But yeah, there is still you know, not loads of places where you do get book reviews. But children's books are sometimes reviewed on Words Without Borders, and they have a roundup. We've had a couple of children's books editions, but not very regularly. European Literature Network, that's a website looking at European translations, and they occasionally, but not have children's books, but not every time. But then there's specialist blogs like, and I think it really, like a big part of this realm is taken up by blogs. There's Planet Picture Book, and that's Laura, a translator in Australia, who's traveling around the world by book and does a sort of roundup per country of children's books that she's come across. There's Trip Fiction is a website where reviews focus on a country or somewhere you can visit, you can travel to by book. But again, they don't have a field on their drop-down menu of authors and illustrators. They still don't have a field for translator. I've suggested it to them. But so there's lots of places like that, you know, in theory, would love to review children's books in translation, but sort of aren't set up in terms of the data, in terms of the mindset of like how they approach that, or what would be helpful to say about it. Just to mention the translator and say something about that process. And there's websites, you know, for anyone who's interested in children's books will know that there are quite a lot of book review sites like Love Reading for Kids, but there's very few places that, you know, really focus on, have a lot on children's books in translation, and very few places where it's children who write the reviews. So that's something I'd love to see more. So I was so happy to see this lovely new blog started the end of last year, or during the pandemic, which is called Juliet's Book Journey, and she's an American, I'm not sure, perhaps 8 or 9 year old, so really quite young, but an avid reader, and she and her mom together are sort of going on a tour of the world and writing about a lot of children's books in translation. So there seems to be this sort of growing movement of blogging, and then there's people like Anne Morgan, who I think is here today, hello, who've toured the world by book and also sort of increasingly interested in children's books. Yeah, I'd love to see more reviews and more by children.
I think perhaps if anybody in the audience today is doing any of this kind of work, and then, you know, please get in touch, because sometimes we miss things, and it's not because we're kind of deliberately omitting or excluding, it's just sometimes we're just trying to catch everything and miss a few here and there.
Yeah, World Kitlet, we do a monthly roundup at the end of the month of reviews that we've come across. Another one I haven't said, and thank you, someone just pointed out in the chat, Outside in World, they regularly publish reviews, whether it's every month or every 3 months, I'm not sure. I think every month they do a roundup of 3 or 4 books that they've reviewed. And they're excellent, with lots of you know, sort of breakdown of target age group and how it might fit into doing a primary curriculum and so on.
And there's with World Kitlet as well, September is like the big month when we go all out to say, you know, sort of blog bonanza. So everything is about World Kitlet month, hashtag World Kitlet month. And just recently as well, it's kind of a little bit galling. In fact, it's very galling that World Book Day is about books and about a day, but very often it has very, very little to do with the world. It would be very nice if we could, I don't know, have a few more translated books, a few more translated children's books on that day. But it's quite difficult to do that.
We'll have to get on the case and start pestering them for next year, suggesting a translated book to have on the World Book Day lineup, because in the UK there's a sort of a list of authors whose books are promoted. So there's I'm saying this for anyone who's not in the UK, there's a promotion for a book for £1 or as a voucher that you can spend at a bookshop. There's a brilliant initiative, but yeah, it's not really. It's not World Book Day. That's on, and it's on the wrong day, and it doesn't really reflect the world. Although they'd have had an increasingly diverse selection of authors, and if you can see Asian English writers, and a slightly more diverse selection.
There's also kind of in recent years been the diverse books. We need diverse books campaign, which is to get more diversity into children's books, especially. And I would say that in the last 10 years, 15 years, there have been a lot more books that have been published that have been written by, say, Asian American or Asian British writers, sort of Asian in the broadest sense, East Asian, South Asian, and so on. And this is hugely beneficial, because these are people who are often sometimes first, second, third, fourth generation, who are writing about things that are, that somehow it's very helpful for translators, because sometimes they cover the ground before we do, and it means that we can build upon what they've done, as well as sometimes it means that what we're doing is not quite so new or quite so strange to us, as in an English reader, somebody who's grown up here, who doesn't necessarily have the foreign cultures that you might be reading about, and a lot of their work is incredibly useful for us. So when people say, well, who should be translating? Should it be people who are from the culture translating? Should it be people who are from the target culture or from the source culture? Sometimes it doesn't matter, and sometimes it's really useful for people from outside the culture to write or to translate. And sometimes it's really useful for people from inside the culture to write and to translate. And I think it's healthier to have a mixture of the two, as long as they're done responsibly and as long as they're done respectfully and tactfully. So, I don't know about your languages, Ruth.
Can I just add something to what Helen was saying? I think, in the broader movement to sort of increase diversity in children's books and improve representation of whether it's ethnic diversity or diversity of many kinds, so that children see themselves in a book. I think when translated children's books are not necessarily ethnically or geographically very diverse, because we've got this real dominance of Western European languages, and yet I think there's a kind of an aspect of diversity that translated children's books really performs, and that's linguistic diversity. And I think although we've got a really wonderful range of writers for children in the UK and in the US of mixed heritage, and and if it's an illustrated book, then we're seeing more brown, more black characters in books, and that's wonderful. But I think there's still a real big absence, both in our classrooms and on our bookshelves, is families who are bilingual and children seeing that mixed heritage being reflected, and that confusion and identity questions that being reflected in children's literature. So I'm always really excited when I come across books where that is actually a topic, that's a theme. So this is one from a few years ago, it's maybe 2010 or earlier, 2007, from Aurora Metro, and it's about it's a Greek book, very rare Greek translation, there aren't many, and it's a young adult book about a girl moving from Athens to Aachen in Germany, and that sort of culture shock and missing her family, but also really dealing with the topic of learning a new language, having struggling to make friendships in a new language, and that's something, even if a children's book in translation doesn't deal with that specifically as a theme, the fact that it's a translation and the fact that that's highlighted on the library shelves or in the classroom, that adds a dimension of consideration of other languages other than English having a value, and other languages other than English having a role, a functional role, whether it's as a career in the future or just in the children's book world.
I mean, it's really funny, is that, because I don't know if you find this with your children, Ruth, but my kids they just used to go out and they'd pick up all of the local slang, and they're always making up their own words. In terms of linguistic creativity, it's the children who are just they just do it naturally, and they go completely bonkers, and they're so rude and they're so wicked because they just mimic everybody outside and their friends and so on, and they come home and they do these. It's just, they can do it. It's not a problem with the child readers. It's a problem with actually moving it along and having fun with it.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating, thank you so much. I'm just gonna, there was just a comment in the chat about all the different resources and links that you've mentioned, which there were many of, and about whether we can get a list of them. I'm just gonna say that they're all Ruth has them there. We can get them, we can put them on the recording, and we can put them with the recording on the Facebook page or something like that, so that the recording of this will be on the Facebook page that I mentioned at the beginning, so they'll be there, and maybe we can link them to that or something, or put some links on and things like that. I'm going to open up to questions. I'm going to ask one more question then, and if anybody's got any questions, then you can either do raised hand or you can put it in the chat and let me know that you've got a question. I can pass over to you. I just wanted to, I think one of the things that there's, I guess, there's two things that have come out of this, really, hasn't there? There's the idea of visibility and being read and being seen, so that so people know that the books are there, but kind of like on bigger scales. But there's also the idea of kind of the work that's being done within schools and educational settings in order to bring those books in as well. I know, Ruth, you've been doing work, haven't you, as a translator with schools, and that to promote children's literature in translation in educational settings, haven't you? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. But yeah, there's a couple of organisations, both charities that I've worked with in some form or other, and one's Shadow Heroes, and they are doing workshops in mainly secondary schools, but also universities, looking at translation as a means to consider ethical issues and issues of diplomacy, of sort of political engagement, and I know that some of the workshops that they've run, so for example, Sarad Hussain and Nariman Yusuf have been looking at comics, and so bringing different types of translation into the classroom and using it as a prism to look at lots of very diverse and interesting topics. And then another organisation that's really trying to bring translation into the classroom in creative ways is the Stephen Spender Trust. And at the moment, we're developing workshops for I'm working with primary schools, but there's some other translators who are working with secondary schools to use creative translation as a means of bridging language discovery, cultural discovery, but also with literacy. And so translation, not just within an MFL or language learning setting, but also using it as a springboard for creative writing and literacy. Yeah, I'm really excited about doing more of that and bringing and sort of linking that with this work, activism with World Kid Lit, and just sort of demonstrating the links between reading books in translation, the process of translation, and the various bits of the curriculum that it can link to, whether it's history, geography, ORI, whatever. Yeah, to have any questions.
Shall we open the floor up to questions? If anybody's got a question, they want to put it in the chat or raise their hand or just shout.
Somebody asked about the publisher I mentioned in New York, and that's called Raycraft Books. That's REYCRAFT Books, Raycraft Books.
Thanks, Helen.
I'm really pleased to say thank you, Barsha, for linking to the CLPE report in the chat. There's a link to the Reflecting Realities, which is some research that's been going on yearly for the last 3 years, I think, which shows really just how shockingly unrepresentative children's books are of ethnic diversity in this country. But there has been a slight increase. I think reports like that and research like that has, I think, helped make publishers realise just what lack there is. But yeah, we're still a long way from having children's books, the authors and protagonists in children's books that are anything like as representative of demographics of this country as they should be. I'm just looking at the chat, see if there's any questions yet.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
That's okay. So I'm sorry, I don't know what's the equivalent of raising your hand here in Zoom. So what's the virtual equivalent? So I just talked. Okay, just one moment. I just saw a spider. Okay.
You sound very calm about it.
All right, just committed murder. I think we can continue. Okay, so we never have spiders here normally. I don't know, it just showed up because I had to ask a question. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. All right, so my name is Nasiba, I'm from Morocco. I'm very grateful for this lecture. I've been really missing events like these during the quarantine, so I'm really grateful to all of you. My question is to Ruth. You talked about translating children books into Arabic. So my question is, when you translate these books from a different culture to what you would call a conservative culture or describe as a conservative culture, do you feel the need to change a few things? Or do you translate it quite literally? Yes.
So when talking about my own experience, I translate from Arabic into English, and yes, that same quandary does apply. Is how much do you change or sort of explain culturally? I can't say much about translation from English into Arabic, I'm afraid. I just haven't had the time or budget to buy many translations into Arabic. But yeah, I have translated a couple of children's books from a publisher in Morocco, actually. And I feel terrible, but the press is just, it's gone out of my head. I can't think the name of the original press. But the writer is Alamed Hashimi Alawi. And I was lucky enough to translate a picture book, which has actually already been translated. And so it's been published in Canada and America. And I was asked to translate it for the African market for a new publisher in Mozambique. And that was a really interesting challenge. And I hadn't seen the English. This was a book called Alia and the Three Cats. It's really gorgeous, and it's been translated into Polish as well, and quite a few other French, I think now. I hadn't seen the the English edition, and I didn't dare write to the Canadian publisher and ask them for it, because that seemed a bit weird. I didn't really want to draw attention to the fact that I was doing another translation for another territory. But I was able to read NetGalley reviews, and I was really curious to see that some of the feedback was about that other translators, about some of the changes that they hadn't made. And one of the things is that one of the cats, they can't remember all the three names, but one was called Pasha, or Basha, which in Arabic culture, oh yeah, and it's oh, I wish I had a copy of the book now to show you, but there's a lovely picture of the cat looking at a red talboush or fez hat on a stool, and it's a sort of imagery of nobility or of leadership. And the name, when you hear the word, I mean, maybe I should ask you, Nasiba, what does it mean to you? And the fact that the cat's called Pasha?
Yes, Basha. It's a word of Turkish origins that was introduced into Arabic from Turkish, and it's very common in the Middle East, more than Morocco, I suppose. But the Basha or the Pasha or the Basha in Arabic is a person of noble descent, someone who is very respected in the community. Like, for example, you know,
Yeah.
some, I'm trying, because you would call, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of people of different backgrounds that you can call a basha. But now, for example, in Egypt, a friend might call his friend a basha. So the meaning changed. He would call his friend Yabasha just as a way of telling, like, for example, you talk to your friend and say, hey, sir, you'd say, hey, basha. So yes, that's the origin of the word.
So it's got that sort of lovely irony that you're sort of, it's a term of respect, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person has the actual standing. Yes. And what's lovely in this picture book is that the character who sees himself as this great basha, this sort of overlord, and like being the boss of his other brother and sister cats, but he himself is really scruffy. And so it's a contrast between the picture and the title that he gives himself, or how he sees himself. And so one of the comments in this review was, that doesn't really work, and I felt that too. And so in my translation, which isn't published yet, I decided to change his name to Prince, and so then that irony is clearer, that he sees himself as a prince, and actually he's really scruffy.
Like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But it's really challenging, especially when there's picture to match it up with, or does the picture actually match the text? So I hope that's a good example for you. But yeah, your question's a really good one, because it is challenging. How much there's temptation to sort of explain or gloss. Translators often use this phrase, a stealth gloss, of squeezing in a stealthy, secretive sort of explanation, which might even just be a couple of words, but sometimes just without explaining or adding any extra text. And sometimes my editors have, like recently, what's been for an adult book I was translating, they have suggested additions to sort of explain things. I was saying, no, you can't do that. You can't. The narrative doesn't explain. It's you sort of discover by from the context, and you can't give too much away. May I say one more example, Jenny?
Yeah, go
on. This is a book I've translated from German, but it's a book I love, Apple Cake and Baklava, and it's about a Syrian girl who moves to Germany, and it's about her first week. She's been in Germany a while, so she speaks German, some German, but it's also about that challenge of moving to a new place, and missing home, missing her granny in Syria, and it's her first 2 days in school in Germany. And throughout the book, it's there's little bits of Arabic, and that was in the German book. And I wanted to keep that as well. And so whenever one of her mom, for example, hasn't learned much German yet, and whenever she speaks, she says it in Arabic. And so so what I decided to do was just always to have her say things twice. So she says ahlan, hello. And I think in speech, that's actually quite normal that you might say hello. It doesn't matter that she says it twice. And so I just managed to squeeze some Arabic in, which I was really sort of pleased that the editor let me. I can't find an example now. But it's kind of clear from the context.
Actually, it's quite interesting you say that, because I tried to do that as well, to kind of leave a few words in, and the feedback that comes from that is actually very positive, and people say, oh, we really love it that you do that, or why do you call the parents mama and baba, and call the grandparents yeah nana? Why did you do that? We really love it. You go, because it's easy, and because you don't have to explain it. So sometimes it's really nice to do that.
But I guess it's also interesting because, as you were saying about children being really creative in terms of the way that they talk and their own language, that there's no problem with bringing in different languages. That's what children's books do all the time, isn't it? Is create their own languages and things as well, I guess. Yeah,
I think children are very welcoming of newness and of new words, new terms. So yeah, we shouldn't be afraid to use them. As long as it's, I mean, if a new term is introduced at a point that's so critical to the plot, and you might fail to understand the plot because of it, then you might need to sort of explain somehow. But on the whole, I think when it's sort of giving background and cultural context, then yeah, I like using words from the original where I can.
Do we have another question?
Not a question, but just a point to add on that. I think there's a book called They Call Me Guerrero, which did really well in the States, and the writer of that, and I'm sorry I've forgotten his name, but and my phone's just gone off the blink, so I can't even look it up. But he did a lovely sort of talk and sort of spoke about the importance of and he uses lots of language that's of the original sort of language there and words from it, and said, that part of the reason is that, to give it that's authenticity. And it's not always just about, certain readers you're looking at. You're trying, you're trying also to, give books to, for example, in his case, Mexican students who haven't seen themselves portrayed before, and actually, well, why not, that give some of this. So it's lovely how the things combine. I think this idea of not just translation, which is magic, but also other cultures, and because kids themselves, I think, are so hungry for all of this. I mean, they, video games, songs, music, whatever, that's just taking from everywhere. So it's just such a lovely thing if books as well could start representing that. So thank you so much for the talk on this. It's just been magic.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I have a really quick question. It's not very academic. It's just that I told my friend who has an 11-year-old that I was coming to this event, and I told her I would try to get some recommendations. I know that her daughter loves fantasy and books about animals. So I was just wondering if you had anything you could throw out at me.
Helen, do you have anything first?
Fantasy.
Helen's new book? Is this appropriate for an 11-year-old, or is it a bit older? I haven't read it yet.
I would say it's if a mature 11-year-old, okay. Although if somebody who's likes floppy things, then don't read this book just
right,
yet.
This is maybe a little bit older. What I would hold up for. So anything else, Lynn?
There's another book again. It's again, if your 11-year-old is very mature and can deal with it, then there is a book that's called The Ventriloquist's Daughter, which is by Li Manchu, and it's about a little girl and her relationship with her father, and it's kind of a coming of age thing, but she's at that stage where she can't really determine whether something is real or fantasy, and so it's a little bit psychological thriller as well. So again, depending upon the maturity of the 11-year-old. I mean, 11 is quite a difficult age, because some 11-year-olds are still very much in the family setting, and very much in the kind of the secure world, and some are ready for the insecure world. And the insecure world can be too scary if you're too young for it.
Yeah, I mean, she's not my daughter, she's my friend's daughter. I think maybe she's a little bit young for her age. It's possibly my feeling about her, but her mum would probably know better than me.
If you wait a couple of years, I can recommend a couple, but they're in progress at the moment.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'll pass that on and I'll see what the mum thinks.
But have a look at World Kidlets and have a look at there, because there are some reviews on there of books that are from different people and writing about books, especially the ones who've written with the ones that their children have read, and they will give you a very honest opinion as to whether it's appropriate for that age group and for what level of maturity.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really hard to give a sort of specific guidance, isn't it? Because I suppose every age at primary, they might be very advanced reader or very interested in fantasy, or like Helen said, much more interested in family or animal books. But that's interesting that you, as you did say that they're pretty interested in animals, I'm going to recommend one that I'm only halfway through, but I'm enjoying so much. I just realised it's another translation from Greek that's it's quite rare, but that's about an island where the politicians and the local leaders have all turned against the black caps because they bring bad luck, and there's a sort of campaign to hunt down and kill all the last black cats, which sounds a bit nasty, but actually it's really fun and a lot of slapstick in it. And this one doesn't have any animal characters, but is, I just think, a really wonderful read for sort of 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds. It's published by Pushkin Press, who do a lot of children's books in translation, so they're a good place to look for chapter books in general for sort of primary age. It's translated from, it's a sort of Polish classic, I think it's from the 60s, and it's one of those classics that was sort of neglected and only translated into English in the last 10 years, I think. It's also kind of quite slapsticky. It's a sort of adventure in the middle of the night, there's a mysterious thing or person or something that's red. Clementine has lost something red, but Clementine's only about 3, so she can't say what it is that's lost. And it unleashes this crazy adventure of everybody going out in the middle of the night, children going out in the middle of the night to look for this red thing, and all tripping up on top of each other, and storms and crazy things happening. So it's quite a silly one, but a fun one to read. I've got tons of books here that I can recommend, but I should probably stop. But
no, this is all great. Thank you.
I'm really conscious that in the UK, I think that we sort of rush to encourage kids into chapter books, longer books, and into reading by themselves. And I'm really a keen proponent of reading together as a family for as long as possible. And with my son, who's 10, we've read some books that are really quite mature or quite grown up and difficult themes. But because we're reading them together, then it's not more challenging things. So Lamprey is one example. I just read it with my husband, and I'd recommend it for sort of a 10 or 11-year-old to read with somebody, but on their own I think they need to be quite mature, because it's a bit spooky, a bit creepy. It's sort of in atmosphere it's a bit similar to it's gone out of my head, I can't remember. Dumbo. There was another Disney film that's about a circus and about I can't think what it's called, or about performance, but it's in that sort of Victorian era of, it sounds horrible, but about freak shows. And this is about a mermaid and it is in that sort of Victorian era of anyone who's different being castigated and separated from society. But it's about breaking past that and breaking through that barrier and seeing the real people and seeing the real characters. And it is an absolutely beautiful, really brilliant, riveting read. But I wouldn't recommend it for a 10 or 11-year-old unless they're really quite a mature reader. But as one to read together, it's absolutely gorgeous. Really, really
I might read that myself.
You should. It's really lovely. It's one of those ones that should have a film made of it. If maybe there already is, I'm not sure.
Well, thank you so much. That's great. I'll definitely pass those on.
Can I just say one more thing, Jenny? Which
is that, no, please.
Following on Helen, thank you for saying, on Well Could Lit blog, there's we're trying to put more and more resources to make it as easy as possible for people to find books for primary school, books for young adults, books from Scandinavia. And so I've been making together with this Well Could Lit is a sort of a collective activist effort by lots of translators, but also librarians, teachers, lots of people coming together. But so we're making these lists of sort of as a kind of a tick sheet, and this is one that I've made for Scandinavia. I've made one for Central Europe and Eastern Europe, but also and this is South America. So it's sort of growing list that you might download to see, tick them off as you read them, or also what we've been doing at home with my boys is cutting them out and sticking them on a map. So when we read a book from Brazil, we stick it on the globe or we stick it on the map, and that's been a really nice way of sort of tangibly making that link between a book and the country that it comes from.
Actually, Matty's question was quite interesting, because actually it's dealt with one of the things that we haven't talked about. I guess I don't think we're going to have time now to talk about either. But the idea that when we've been talking about visibility of the books and who's reading the books and who's choosing the books for them to read, a lot of the resources that we've been talking about that are available are not ones that children would go to, I guess. Yes. Mm-hmm. So particularly for a 9, 10 and 11-year-old who would go and choose their own books to read and would go to a bookshop and have a massive selection on the shelf of books that they would go to and go and find something that they'd like with animals or with fantasy or with sports or whatever it might be. If those books aren't visible, then it's going back to that idea of somebody having to go and look for them, somebody having to go and put them in their hand, rather than the child being able to go and go and choose them themselves, I guess. And so it's those children's voices that I guess we also need to hear in this conversation as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's sort of a matter of educating booksellers to think about it in that way, even if they only do it for 1 week a year, or for Well Could Lit month in September. So for example, in Well Could Lit month last year, I went into Waterstones, I went into our local independent bookshop as well, and I said, would you like some help putting a table out or a presentation? And the Waterstones, they were really happy to, but didn't know where to start. And so I just went around with the bookseller saying, this one is, this one is, this one is, this is translated. And so loads of them are on the shelf already. They have got those books, but the booksellers don't necessarily realise that they're translated or that there's anything extra interesting to sort of highlight about them. So yeah, we're happy to perform that service and help librarians and booksellers to see that extra sort of, I think, extra marketability of a book.
And the other thing that we try to encourage people to do is that if you can, leave a review somewhere. If you've got a chance to, if you've read something and you like it, leave some stars or leave some hearts or write a review or recommend it or something like this. Or if you're on social media, then put it on social media so that it helps us to get more visibility out there. It's always very useful to do that.
May I ask another question, please?
Yeah, it'll have to be quick because we need to tie things up. But yeah, if it's a quick one.
Yes. Okay. So I just want to know whether you're, as a translator myself, actually, I graduated 3 years ago, but I'm still more focused on research. But I'm really interested in the world of publishing. So I'm asking if you would like to give a future lecture on this topic, on how to contact publishing houses, etc., when it comes to translating books for kids.
Again, on that topic, we do have a lot of information on World Kid Lit blog. But yes, I would love there to be more talks and more lectures about this.
I know it's a question that requires a lecture. This is why I told you, would you be interested in giving a lecture on that sometime in the future?
Perhaps you could put that in an email to Jenny and then contact us after that. Yeah.
There was a quick question in the chat about bilingual publishers. Do you know of any publishers in the UK that publish bilingual versions that you could?
Anne has put a reply man trilingua. I would agree that's a really good one to go to. But also on World Kid Lit blog, we have a search bar, and if you search for bilingual books, we had a blog post last year of about. It started off with 16 publishers that published bilingual books, and then we kept on adding to it. So there's more than 20 book publishers listed who do bilingual editions. So there's a lot, and there's a lot of interesting ones which are not just a straight same text in one language and same text in another. There's some lovely ones where the two languages are woven together. So one character speaking one language, another character speaking another. So it's really wonderful that there are books out there. Hard to find them, but there are books that really play with bilingualism and multilingualism.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap up there. I will just say though that Ruth is going to be joining us for a talk at Cork World Book Fest in April as well. So there will be more, which you'll be able to find out details of via my Facebook page as well. So there will be more to come, and I will make sure that I'll put the resources that we've mentioned today on the Facebook page as well, for anyone who's not managed to catch them or wants them. I'll see if I can collate them. But don't forget to check out the World Kid Lit blog, which I think is probably a good starting point to kind of take you to some of the other ones as well, but I'll try and get as many as I can. Ruth and Helen, thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your knowledge and experience today. It's been brilliant, and I think we could probably carry on for about another hour. But thank you, and I'm sure everybody will join me in a virtual applause.
Well done, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'll just remind you that our next event is on the 22nd of May, and the details will be available very soon. But thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you, goodbye.
I'm amazed, Ruth, at how many books you have to hand. I guess you're very well prepared.
Do you want to have a sneak view of the books on the bed?
Oh, wow.
I didn't know what was going to come up, so yeah.
I've been taking notes as well. So yeah. But
and inevitably there was one where Helen, you mentioned you were talking about cultural representations or representations of places, of cultures that are very ingrained and very well known, and how do you convey that familiarity? And I immediately wanted to reach to a wonderful book about fairy tales and fairy tale characters inside the villains, which Claire and I were talking about at an event on Saturday. And I thought, oh no, that's one that I haven't got here. Inevitably. Great. Shall we log off?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank
Helen. That was lovely to hear you. Thank you.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, let me get the forms to me when you can, so that I can make sure that you get paid for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks so much for having us, Jenny.
Bye.
Bye.